Hello, chess friends, and welcome to the fourth and final installment of the highlight reel from my Sunway Sitges tournament, which amazingly finished 9 to 10 days ago already. Time flies when you're not playing chess. I've got some great moves for you today, but before I get into them, I want to quickly talk to you about what I was doing with those first three highlight videos and just clarify a project that I have going on right now underneath the other project that you're seeing. So it was actually in Sitges, I think the day of round 4, before playing the 4th round, that I recorded the most important chess video that I think I've ever recorded. And I've recorded hundreds and hundreds of chess videos at this point, thousands upon thousands, if not 10,000 streams. So if you count all those videos, some of which are prepared, some of which are off the top of the dome, a lot of chess videos and chess material I've done. I think it was the most important. It's the video called The Dangers of Chess. And it turned out to only be about 12 minutes long, one of my shortest videos ever, if not the shortest. And when I was recording that video and I was playing at that tournament also, I was simultaneously trying to coach some chess players that I'd met there on the very subject of dealing with their egos, recognizing that their opponents are people who also love chess and have put in the work and the effort just like we have, and respecting those adversaries and not being so hung up on this idea that you need to win and that everything should go, every result should play into your story. And I was trying to coach some people on this and saying I can play in a tournament now, I can lose now and not lose my mind over it. It's acceptable and all that. And through 4 rounds at Sitges, I think some of those people were thinking well, that's really easy for you to say when you aren't losing any games, because miraculously through 4 rounds of Sitges, I hadn't lost a game and I'd beaten I'd won 2 games and drawn against 2 strong grandmasters. And so you could say this to any chess player, right? When your results are going well, you're going to be nice and in a good mood, and you could have the appearance of being, all cool and zen about everything. And then the moment you lose a game, it's off the rails and woe is me and, excuses and anger and who knows what. And I was almost hoping to lose a game just to show them, look there, I lost with equanimity. I still had fun today. I still got to play chess. This is still something that we should appreciate. And, I got my wish soon enough as I lost that game in round 5. And I think I took the loss very happily-ish, I wasn't trying to lose the game during the game, but perfectly content. I've showed you the game in part 3, and I think it was a wonderful game. I'm happy to have participated in it. So what I've tried to do in these highlight videos that plays into that subject, which is another story from Sitges, right? But because I actually recorded the video there. But what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to humanize my opponents in the way that I've presented these first 3 videos. I've deliberately, and normally I never flip the board, I just show it with white at the bottom and black at the top, and people complain, I can't see your perspective, and I'm like, dude, it's bird's eye, and it's been a thing for years. But I flip the board every time to put my opponent at the bottom. I try to present the situations from their perspectives, basically every time, and to highlight their good moves, and almost none of mine, except perhaps in the 3rd installment where I showed a complete game, so I had to show my moves as well, which include at least one move which I might have thought was good, but mostly my opponent just outplayed me that game as well. So what I've mainly tried to do is I've tried to show the great moves of my opponents and celebrate those as part of this project of teaching you to appreciate and celebrate your opponents, and to not always assume that you're the only one that matters and that you should be winning every game. So that's why my highlights videos up to this point have not featured any of my exclams or anything about me winning any games or anything like that, and rather, all the things that I could learn from the best moves my opponents played, as well as, 2 examples of myself getting basically in one game schooled and in the other game posterized by 2 players who beat me. Those are the only 2 games out of 10 that I happened to lose at this tournament. I had a lot more draws than I used to have because I'm a whole different player, but we can talk about that another time, because I think I know I will do a video where I talk about how to set your goals before a tournament and then assess how that tournament compares to the goals you walked into it with, and where you go next from a tournament. So I'm going to do a video on sort of assessing tournament by tournament moving forward. So we'll talk about the new player that I am there. But I've shown the 2 games that I lost and the great moves my opponents played. But I did play a couple good moves. I couldn't fully deny that. And so here in this final part, I will finally share with you a couple good moves that I played. And this is going to be largely in the way of a sort of masterclass on the Sicilian, in a sense, because of the games I won. 3 of them were in Sicilians, and the 2 games that I'm going to show you something from today are both Sicilians. So here we go. First, we're going to see a critical sequence from this game here. So this game here, as you may recall if you saw the first video in this series, this game here I was on the back foot out of the opening. My opponent played very creatively and aggressively and got me onto my back foot. But at this point, I was starting to feel confident that I had escaped things. My opponent played 2 moves, which I thought were imprecise. And it's my move, and I can see my knight can come off the back rank finally. I've stabilized with e6 against any knight d5 coming in quickly. I've blocked this pawn on e5, and it's sensitive. It's a long-term weakness on e5 here. My opponent's trying to regain the bishop pair here, but I've got better prospects of attacking the king, a bigger weakness on e5. I thought I could just play knight c7, knight takes c6, b takes c6, and black had to be slightly better, honestly, already, was my feeling. And yet, I pushed myself and began a very bold maneuver for which I believe I deserve some exclamation points even. So here's how it starts. Bishop to g2. The bishop just seems to flop stupidly into the opponent's camp, and I don't even know for sure if it's my very best move, but I think it's a good move, comparable to my best options, and I think it gets an exclam anyway for being creative, because it's the kind of move you wouldn't look at, right? It just plops here where it looks like it's in trouble, but it gets out of the way of knight takes c6, so it leaves this knight hanging while hanging itself. Black sort of semi-threatens queen h4, which would kind of win the h3 pawn in some cases, threaten bishop h6. So I fully expect white to attack this piece with either a rook or a queen, right? Which white did. And then the intended follow-up is rook takes c3. Put another exclam on that one. That little baby there. So yeah, the bishop's dangling on g2, and now we're sacking the rook. My opponent could take the rook or could take the bishop first, which is what my opponent did in the game, was actually just take the bishop to see if I would, just retreat the rook from there without any damage to the king side. If they take the rook, then I'm going to be able to pick up the knight, right? But it's not going to be 2 pieces for rook. It's going to be an exchange sack because this is still dangling at the end. Now, I had to calculate the king coming in or out, right? For example, if the king comes out, I take here, take here, take here. And we can see the c3 pawn is indefensible. We can see white doesn't have time to take on b7. They're going to have to give this pawn and move this rook and this king off of the dark squares. So I'm going to have time to collect the second pawn for the exchange and keep chasing this king. And the king's going to wander towards the king side, towards h1, which is the safest square left on the board, but not a very safe square. and the game's going to look somewhat like it actually did in the game. So but I'll just tell you, I think the evaluation is good for black, and you'll see more of that position later. The other option is the king comes this way, and then we have to take here, and then I think I take on c3 with the queen first, but this pawn could get defended. But then I have this knight d6 move, if I remember right. Sorry, I didn't write down my analysis of this, so I have to check in my head if I'm getting this right. So the idea is to play bishop takes e5, and the king is trapped on the dark squares. And, one move to check against would be queen b7, bringing the queen to defend b2 and stuff. But after bishop e5, you're still threatening checkmate on a1, which white can't deal with. So the king's going to be very weak. They're going to have to give back the exchange here. Grab this pawn. Maybe bring this knight to d5 with a tempo. Rook can come to b8. Knight on d5 is going to be great. c3 is weak. I think black has basically a winning attack here, even in a sort of more simplified position. If white had a b pawn, it might still be a mess, but with the a pawn, it's going to be death, I believe. And the other option is like the queen comes here to defend the pawn and keep the bishop out. And then I think my plan was knight d6, because the pawn can't take it because of checkmate. And we poke the queen that needs to hang on to the pawn here. So she goes somewhere like this. And then from here, maybe continue the attack with, I guess, bringing the rook. So the knight's probably still immune. These pieces can't move because they have to keep the pawn defended. It's very hard for white to move very much in this position, I think. And my plan is to go like knight c4 or rook c6 next. So I don't know if that's 100% precise, because it's hard to replicate or remember what you calculate in the heat of the moment when you're working so hard. But yeah, that's my thought of what I was up to here. If the king had gone towards b1 in this version of the sacrifice, okay, and that's basically all there is to this position where white takes. Right, whichever way the king goes, once I take on a5, white has to take the bishop, or they're just down material, right? 2 pieces against the rook. And then, yeah, then the attack plays from here. Okay, so in the game, after rook takes c3, my opponent played queen g2. And now, in this position, I think my default move... Well, I had 2 default moves. One is the rook comes back to c7, defending the pawn here, and the game goes on. I think black has an advantage. Opposite colored bishops means that the attacks on both sides are going to be very important. The e5 pawn still looks weak to me. The only thing that I don't love about this, obviously, is that it's slowing down this knight coming off of e8. So that made me unhappy. The other option here would be to play rook c5, hitting the knight. Now, an important little detail is that white can't get clever with queen b7, trying to extricate their mess and get rid of our queen side, right? If they destroy the whole queen side, then all the endgames are going to be perfectly fine for them, if not winning. But we're always going to have check and then grabbing the knight. So there's never queen takes b7. Okay, so rook c5 is going to force the knight to b7. If the knight came to c4 to hold this, then b5, and white still loses this, but the knight's just wandering floppily. So the knight's going to come here. I'm going to come here. And this was the safest option to me, because material's more or less equal. The knight is sort of weirdly flopping. I know my bishop has been released, and my knight obviously can't be kept back. Now the e5 pawn's gone. It's coming out when it wants to. But even this, I was not 100% sure how it was going to play out if white played some moves like queen c6 or bishop a6, sort of trying to temporarily go up a pawn again and just trying to put a bunch of pieces in the queenside area and not let all my pieces get over for the attack against the king. And then I also had this thought in my mind, like, this pawn's kind of weak. I don't want to trade it. I want to win it. I want to get something out of it at some point, right? So that made me, that had made me look in this position for any moves that might be even better than rook c7 or rook c5. And what I came up with was an absolutely beautiful move. It didn't surprise Kostya, because Kostya seems some famous Lasker game with a similar theme, but it's still a sweet move to find and have and play yourself in an over the board game, just flat out, hanging your rook out to dry on this square while not, defending this pawn, not bringing out a new piece. It's like white gave you a chance to back out of the rook sack, and you just keep trying to sack the rook. So yeah, I mean, my notes say the madman continues, but I'm admirative. Maybe that's not a word in English, but in French you could say admiratif of madmen, right? So to me, that's kind of like an exclam. So rook a3, attacking the knight in this. So again, queen b7 is going to miraculously lose material for white because of the check, right? And then you take the knight while saving the rook. So, but the rook is so weirdly placed. White's not forced to take it like he did in the game. I think the other line that could really make sense would be knight b3, actually. So here the idea is to maybe trap the rook. And after rook takes a2, you have king b1, but the rook will just come out. And then I was thinking rook e4 here, trying to cut off its retreat. And of course, I planned b5. And this variation felt risky, but I didn't see a way for white to stop me from playing rook a4. Which, if white takes, I play b takes a4. It doesn't matter that my pawn structure is bad. I'm tearing up the white king, right? Like the pawn comes to a3. I've already gotten rid of the a2 pawn. If this rook trades, then e5's hanging as well. So to tear apart the opponent's king's cover was enough of an incentive for me to do something that looked risky when my calculation told me, yeah, you can get away with it. And then one other variation I had was knight b7, rook a2, king b1, rook a4, queen c6, like in the other line with the trade on e5, right? Coming in and taking over queenside space, and then I have to go rook b4, I think. And again, they could grab the pawn. And this was kind of the other position I was looking at. And again, I couldn't be 100% confident of this position because it looked kind of messy as well. But compared to the rook takes e5 version of this, I liked not trading rooks. I liked having more material on the board. I thought there was a good chance that white would tactically lose to knight c7 or something here, trying to break down this construction. And yeah, so that's why I went for rook a3, was basically those considerations there. Hard to calculate to the end on all of these lines at once. But and the positions, you reach a point where you kind of have to evaluate without it being possible to be 100% certain. But certainly I did choose the riskiest options out of those options. So it was nice. I had some confidence, even though my confidence had recently been, hurt a little bit as far as middle games and calculation. My profile would have said, just keep playing with the safer position against the lower rated player, small advantage, comfortable. Why start sacking rooks and rely on yourself to calculate correctly? It doesn't really make sense, but somehow I had I had some confidence here and I played it. So now again, in this version, compare rook takes c3, I still have to calculate king b1 and king to d2. King d2 happens in the game, so I'll just show you king b1 for a little bit. I calculated here, here, and now I thought rook takes e5 would be most likely or obligatory. Queen here is going to allow check and mates. And bishop a6, which I haven't marked, probably would just lose to knight d6. Hitting the queen, this rook is busy defending this rook. I don't know. Maybe there's still some line here. Maybe I'm not looking hard enough. Queen c7, not allowing rook b8, and pinning this down looks potentially like I've messed things up, actually. So maybe better to go knight c7 instead of knight d6, so that we're hitting this and just trying to come to d5 in case of rook takes e5, which I still sort of expect, like in the other line. Yeah, so there's queen b7, bishop e5, which was a bit complicated, and I had to spend time on queen e4. Is there knight d6 now? No, with the queen on a5, it's not as obvious, because the queen's still on a5. You go here, you don't have immediate checkmate, and if you check, the king could try to come out. Bishop h6, rook d2, you haven't finished them off. So maybe here... Oh yeah, here there was an insane sick move. Instead of going to d6, you first go queen b6 check here. And if the king goes to c1, now you just play bishop h6, regaining your material. You haven't yet sacked your knight, so now we won't play knight d6. And if the king goes this way, I think it's knight f6 instead of knight d6. Yeah, I put an exclam on it in my PGN. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and they're dead. But anything else, the knight comes to d5 very quickly from here. And we continue the murderous rampage that this game is becoming. Then I also looked at, after queen a5, the move queen to d2. Queen b6 check, king c1, and queen c5, just coming around and trying to pick up my pawn over here. And yeah, I can either win this pawn or bring the knight to d5, and I felt like still a very, very strong dark square attack going on against queen e3. You can probably take it. I mean, you can also keep the middle game going, I'm sure, with queen a3. I think black has enough, but you could also do this, win back the exchange. Black's up a pawn. This thing's still weak. Certainly pretty good. So that gives you a sense. There were a lot of variations. I also looked at queen e2 in this position and looked at knight c7 or knight d6 here. So it's complicated. You've got to be sure you can get to the king here. I mean, sure. Again, it's a question of experience versus calculation. There are probably some players who would just do it off of, the intuition of their experience. Other players who would try and calculate it to the end. Me, somewhere in between. At this point, I did some calculations to try and justify it a little bit more, and I also had some experience suggesting to me that I was probably right, even if so. I didn't have to calculate every variation to prove every single thing to myself, but enough demonstrative variations sort of confirm my instinct. My opponent made a run for it, and so we'll skip ahead a little bit further. I'll use some arrow keys to just show you where it goes. The king runs away as expected to the king side. I think I expected queen f2 here and was just going to go put my queen over on somewhere random like b4, a4. Let me just evaluate the situation for anybody, because the main part of this is not to calculate further than this, right? This variation I only calculated as far as knowing that I was going to get the second pawn, and I evaluated, okay? And my evaluation was that black is clearly better and honestly leaning like 95% towards winning. Now, what do I have? I've got a knight and two pawns against rook. On the surface, that's not obvious at all, right? Materially, you would think that, depends where the knight is, depends who has the initiative, is it a middle game, an end game, whatever. In an end game, you might think the rook would generally still be better than the knight and two pawns in a lot of end games. In a middle game, the knight would have its better chance to shine, but it would have to be on a great square. And look, this is my knight against the rook. Obviously, my initiative's done once I capture the second pawn, right? I'm not checkmating the king. I'm now going to have to play this position out with what? Some Some slow something? Yes, some slow something, exactly that. The idea is this. The king has nowhere safe to go on the board. We've got opposite-colored bishops. As long as we're in a middle game, so no queen trade, as long as we're in a middle game with opposite-colored bishops, I'm always going to be able to threaten the king in a way that's going to occupy enough of white's forces that I effectively have an advantage in material, basically, because some value of their pieces is just defending the king. And ultimately, I'm even going to just keep improving the position of my knight, keep building up by advancing pawns on this side of the board where the king has tried to hide, and slowly chip away at the king's position and create sort of decisive threats. And even down in exchange, I can eventually create threats of trying to put a knight on g3 against the king on h1. How is white ever going to stop knight g3 with a light squared bishop on the board? Even though they're up material, they'll never be able to keep me from outposting on their own g3 square. And then this king's position's going to be forced onto, dark squares, get rattled. Maybe g2. Maybe you could somehow go between g2 and h1 and dodge on those two light squares. But it's going to be a really, really tough defensive task for white. So my evaluation, borderline of winning for black. And I didn't calculate more than that. And you can see how things go. I'll just briefly highlight a few things for you in the conclusion of this game because I mainly want to get to the next game. The next game is supposed to be the main focus of this video, and we've already spent a little bit of time on this first segment, so let's skip through a few moves quickly. I'm avoiding any trades I can, and I'm looking for opportunities to improve the knight's position. Chip away at the king, so you'll see me get in the move h5 pretty soon, which is a big accomplishment for black. But first here, I decided to save my pawn with this move here. Actually, I didn't put an exclam on it yet, but I think eventually, when I finish annotating this game, it's very complicated, but my tentative assessment is that this move b5 is deserving of an exclam as well. It looks like a very weird move on the far side of the board, we've weakened the king, it's imperative to improve the knight, but it's a very slow-paced checkmating attack. I am trying to checkmate white, but this is part of my checkmating plan. Here's the thing. I want to play the move h5, but if white plays g5 in this particular position, my knight is awkward for a moment. If it goes to d7, bishop takes g6, probably ruins things. If it goes to h7, then after h4, I don't know about digging it out. The obvious square is this, right? Trying to go to f4 or c3 or e3 at some point. But the queen's still on e3, so it can't go there yet. And after bishop f3, this is very awkward for me, because if the knight moves, I guess knight c3 would be the only move, right? And then rook here, and I thought white's actually going to be able to grab the pawn on b7. Once white's grabbed the pawn on b7, there's an important change in the position, which is that white has a winning plan of just pushing a queenside pawn down the board. Also, there's a difference that every endgame is now winning for white. If you look at this position, I'm only winning in the middle game. I'm not winning in the endgame, for sure. But I might be drawing in the endgame, right? It's not guaranteed that I would lose this endgame at all. Might be close to equal, might be slightly worse. I can probably draw it. But in this variation I'm showing you here, once I drop the b7 pawn, I'm probably losing every single endgame. That's a worry. That's a stress. And speaking of losing endgames, if I brought the knight in the direction it wants to go, then after queen f3, you'll see that I cannot avoid the queen trade because of the knight's position. And if you take the queens off here, I'm pretty close to lost, right? Yeah, I probably am going to drop b7. Yeah, probably going to just be lost. So we have to be very, very, very careful, right? And so b5 is played, partly so that pawn's not hanging. Partly I'm placing my pawns in the best way to fight against white's bishop and queen. I'm taking away yet another square, bishop c4. I'm not hanging this pawn here. I'm not hanging on the b file. I'm stopping these pawns from moving. And I'm waiting for the right moment to improve the knight because it's not yet there. Okay. Long explanation. But I think it was one of the key moves, maybe the most important move of this whole phase, the least trivial, because like here, after I go queen g5, I think white had no way really to stop the move h5 anymore, because against queen f4, I have queen h4 hitting this pawn, and white's in disarray there. So rook here, and I'm able to force the pawn trade. And again, queen f4, queen h4. So I force that pawn trade, and now this king is even more open, right, without a g-pawn. I've traded a rook pawn for a not rook pawn. This was like a big, and but one could say kind of obvious improvement for black. But the b5 move that sort of prepared it is less obvious, I think. Okay, so we get here. Now the next phase is going to be to improve my pieces. Here I wanted to play my knight to f4. You notice that white has set up some pressure against my position, so it's not easy to advance here because my light squares are vulnerable. Even though I've got 3 pawns trying to hold out the light squares, this is 2 rooks and queen. It's a heavy middle game, opposite colored bishops, a lot of firepower pointing towards my king. I need to even respect moves like just bishop takes g6 at some point if the queen were on the g file or somewhere. You know, bishop g6, pawn takes g6, queen takes g6. The knight would be hanging. There'd be checkmate if the knight moves. You know, f7 would be opening up, e6 opening up. White doesn't need much to get a good situation with rook against the remaining 2 minor pieces with my king open, right? So I have to be very careful here. I can't go bishop e5, starting to go after g3 because if queen takes h5. If I move my king to the wrong square, I might allow you know, f7 or h5 kind of tactics at some point. So I have to be careful. And I thought about the move e5 in this position to bring the knight to f4. That's going to block off some of this and support my g6 square. That square actually needs support. The key in general is to outpost your knight on dark squares against the light squared bishop, right? It'll take some light squares away from the opponent. It'll be unassailable. They can't sack back in an exchange in many positions when they're down 2 pawns. That's too many in general to seek refuge in opposite colored bishops. So I want to play e5 and put the knight on f4, but white plays rook here. And now if the knight comes to its desired square, there's queen f4. You can give a check and the queen just slips away. So you don't have knight f4, but if you now move the queen away somewhere like this, white can go takes. I know I told you 2 pawns down, it's hard to play an exchange sack, but here white can get at least 1 pawn back, and I even thought this move might be more terrifying. Setting up, you know, the rook going somewhere and then checking, and here, and bishop here coming after this square. So what we need to still respect the opposite colored bishops and their attacking potential, right? If white can give back the exchange and get a raging attack against my king, notice that in this position, like my e5 pawn's blocking my bishop. I almost just want to sack it to have activity, and white could get a pawn here. Then they'd only be down that 1 e5 pawn blocking my bishop. It is not clear that black is better, certainly not winning. So I need to be a little bit more clever here, and I played this subtle retreating move here. I mean, it's still looking at the squares the knight wants to use, but the real plan is to do this. Meanwhile, I'm also supporting f7 if I need to use the rook for something. Okay, so now e5 happens. I thought white was preparing the move c4 here when they played rook g4, but then they didn't go for it. Yeah. So one interesting idea is if I play b4, trying to keep the position blocked for the rooks, right? No, just fighting the rooks by not trading, and also not giving the bishop that square. Then, you know, here, trying to get this back and this back, and then, I don't know, maybe like knight f4, bishop a6, queen c5. Some position like this could be possible, right? Yeah, I was thinking maybe white was going for something like that, but then he backed off and just held things together, which is long-term losing. So bring the knight to f4. By the way, it wasn't obvious for me this decision to block the bishop, but it lets me get the rook out instead of the bishop. So now I was moved 39, and I only had 2 minutes left, and I sort of blundered, played rook d2. I should just play some waiting move low on time, queen d6, queen d7, maybe even rook d4 is okay. But rook d2 blunders right in. I mean, I was thinking, I'm getting ready to play like queen c5 and start tightening the screws, but I just blundered right into rook d1, trading a piece. And now I realized, right? We make time control, but I felt almost like I have to start over at winning this game because trading off rooks is so against what I want to do. I need to checkmate white, and now I just gave up a rook. White had 2 rooks. It's the, I gave up my only rook. There's this theory about, having more of the same piece is less valuable than having new kinds of pieces. So white having 2 rooks, they kind of replicate each other a little bit, but black really needed their rooks. So I've definitely given up a lot of my advantage. But luckily, I'm still in really good position. It's very hard for white to stop me from playing f5 and e4, which is going to make their bishop really bad by blocking out so many light squares with my own pawn structure, and my bishop's going to become good as well. So I think it ended up not being as terrible as I feared it was, even though I had to trade a rook and retreat. It felt really terrible, but I just followed through with the plan here anyway. Play e4, setting up all my pieces where they need to be, and here's the last ditch c4 from white. And this is where I stopped and used 14 out of 24 minutes, so almost all my time, because I sensed that either knight e2 or knight d3 was likely to be a forced win. And yeah, I mean, we could look at, queen, we could play pawn to b4 or queen c5, whatever kind of, no, we're trying to win the game here. So I calculated for a while, and knight e2 going for knight g3, there's rook d1, and if you come here, and they can remarkably walk into this diagonal, and there's no obvious, knight e2, rook takes queen, knight f1, king here. It doesn't work out. So you kind of want to set it up with bishop here. So you can go knight check, knight f1 check, queen h2 checkmate, because the king won't be able to come out. But then in this position, I found this move, bishop f1, which to me still seemed to offer resistance. Remember what I told you about how, like, if the knight comes to g3, the king, if he gets forced to a dark square, he's slaughtered. But this move gives the king this square, right? And then he seems to skate out of being slaughtered. All right. Okay, in analysis, I found a win for black in this line after the game, but during the game, that started to not work, and I found a win with knight to d3, which I think is... I don't know if there's a better win when 2 different moves win, but okay. This was the line that I found easier to calculate. There's no rook to d1 because of knight f2. We're threatening smothered mate. So the main move you might expect here would be rook to f1 stopping smothered mate. But now we've blocked the queen out and we just bring our queen in. Threatening bishop e5, threatening knight f2, knight h3 kind of moves. And white's lost. I'll just put a line on the board for you that I calculated during the game. In hindsight, this move is even easier to win because white has nothing useful to do and you still play here, I think. But okay, this is what I calculated in the game was sort of, you start with the more direct lines and if they work, you just go with them, right? So you come here, here, here. The king's escaped all the checks other than rook f5, so white has to give the rook, and then you just have to see it's not perpetual, which obviously it's not. Black's got enough pieces, right? Just don't put the king somewhere where you allow bishop e4 with check, I guess, right? And the king goes out through f4 and e3. So that I calculated, and I even figured out it's more likely that white's going to play a bishop f1 defense here than rook f1. And this move is actually harder to crack than the other one, because again, knight f2, the king gets to g2, and somehow suddenly he's like slippery on those light squares, right? But I found a winning move here, queen f4. The threat is simply queen f3 check. If the king comes up, you'll have bishop e5. If the rook comes up, you'll have queen takes bishop. And if the bishop comes up, then it plugs the king's light square escape, right? And then you go knight f2, king h2, bishop e5. So white's gonna try taking the piece. Now important, you give check. the king still can't come up because bishop e5, and you just checkmate him down a rook. You don't even recapture. You're not down in exchange. So so rook g2, and now we have to take a move to take this, but resulting position is dead for white. There's a simple threat of queen f1. If the rook blocks, you've got checkmate, and if the king comes up, you have bishop e5. The only move that stops queen f1, really, well, there's king to g1, and then you would just check him back, right? Like queen b1 stops you from getting in, and then you just play d2, hilariously. The rook's pinned, and, you know, this guy just rolls in. Not a very long variation. Just, you know, oh, okay, that just does it, okay. So, yeah, so my opponent tried king h2, check, check, check. We just rearrange things for him a little bit. Checkmate. All right, so that was one highlight. It's not an obvious or simple game, but you know, the concept with rook c3, rook a3 is exciting and correct, and the execution was almost good. Next game. Not only is it a treat for me to get to play chess at this point in my life, but to play against a grandmaster is a special treat. There's a point in everybody's life where a grandmaster is sort of a mystical thing, and you dream of playing one someday. And I remember playing a grandmaster in Blitz on ICC, and it was a big deal to me the first time I got to play a grandmaster, the first time I won a Blitz game against a grandmaster. Now I'm like, Blitz, whatever, you know. Everybody's played 10,000 Blitz games, and who cares if you've beaten a GM or something. But at the time, it was a big deal to me, and I'm sure for some people it still is, right, to play a grandmaster in Blitz online. I remember playing in a simul and thinking it was amazing, big deal to get to play against a grandmaster in a simul. You know, I got to play against Walter Brown, I think 6-time U.S. champion, and it was just awesome, you know. And then there was a point in my career where I played GMs all the time, and it was, you know, they're just another chess player that you play against, and the mystery and mysticism of it all had just kind of faded away, and it was just chess. But now, after all these years without getting to play, and my own level having come down a bit, and occasionally sneaking off to play some less prestigious local weekend Swiss, or a game in the French league against some other regional French team now, you know, it's not at the level of the 9-round Grandmaster Norm Opens that I got to, that were part of my standard diet, and that I almost took for granted at some point in my life. And so, having basically not played for 10 years, but also, you know, even when I have snuck out to play, you know, I've played against players rated 2,000, 2,100, and I haven't been snobby about it because they're just as good as me now, you know, and it's fun and exciting, and we play great games back and forth together. So it's no disrespect at all to them, or any slander on a 2,100 or saying I'm higher rated than them or anything like that, which I barely managed to still be. But now to play against a grandmaster is like a special treat again. That's what I want to get at. To, like, you know, to play a grandmaster, like, oh, special cachet, and yeah, I'm going to enjoy it in a special way, and know that it's rare. And, you know, there's a whole good thing about not looking at who the opponent is or the ratings or whatever. But of course, you have to do your preparation so you see that they're a GM or not. And yeah, for many people to play your best, it's best not to give undue respect and to play your heart out against anybody. But for me, at the phase that I happen to be in my life, it's sort of like an extra little something special to be like, oh, wow, I'm going to play a game with a grandmaster. And so in round 8 of this tournament, I was paired with a grandmaster for the 3rd time. And I thought to myself, well, this is quite likely your last time to play a grandmaster for a long time. After the tournament, a friend asked me, when's the last time you beat a grandmaster? And I said, I don't know when the last time was that I played a grandmaster. And I had to go back in my game history 6 years to find the last time I played a Grandmaster, and it was a game that I don't even remember, but according to the USCF website, I won. So the length of time, my friend was like, you just don't beat Grandmasters anymore. Well, because I don't play them, Who knows if I would win or lose if I got to play them. So it's been a long time, and it's a special thing, and so when in round 8 I was paired with a Grandmaster, I thought to myself, well, you better especially enjoy this game because it may be your last game against a Grandmaster for a really, really long time, years. Because let's say I lost that game, which I didn't, I drew it, but if I lost that game, I probably would be too low in the pairings to get paired with a Grandmaster again. So I drew that game. And then in round 9, I got paired with a Grandmaster, and again, it's this is likely your last game against a Grandmaster. And even though I won this game, it still was my last game against a Grandmaster. So luckily, I cherished it. And played a very, very, very interesting game. Okay, so we go to the Najdorf, which I've played for a long time. My opponent in this game, I think, has a preference for English attacks. So when I showed him knight g4, he preferred, rather than challenging the knight g4 line, to just back up and play f3 instead and get an English attack anyway. I don't know of any way for black to prevent an English attack against f3 if there's some big deal why f3 is bad. I don't know it. My opponent played it, and we just went into a standard English attack position anyway. So he prevents me from gaining more space here. I prevent him from gaining more space there. Yeah, we're out of my move-by-move preparation already, but I've been playing the Najdorf on and off for a long time. I've played other openings too, but this is probably my most played defense to e4 over the course of my career, so I have, comfort when I'm in this opening. Okay, so we're developing. It's hard for me to come up with anything brilliant here. If I play b4, it's going to be a bad pawn sack. If I play a5, it's going to be a bad pawn sack. He wants to play g4, but it's going to take him, 4 moves, which in a Najdorf Sicilian with kings in opposite areas is, I almost said it's going to take him 100 million moves, but it's, rook g1, g3, then h3, then g4. If you play h3 too soon, black can just play h4, and you're not getting g4, g5. So it's kind of an eternal process. I've got some time in the meantime to do something with it, but it's also not so easy for me to figure out what to do, because I could put the rook on c8, but then what? I can make the d5 pawn break, but since I couldn't get the knight off c3, if and when I go d5, which I didn't do here, the opponent's going to trade, and then perhaps, plop the knight on f5 in some of these situations. And my position's not that robust yet, right? Like, where do I go from there? I make the pawn break, but now I've opened files, and my king's still here, and what am I doing? Maybe in this position I would just have g6, bishop g5. I don't know. So anyway, it's not obvious to me if and when black wants to play d5, if black wants to play some more developing moves first, like rook c8 and bishop e7, but bishop e7 often makes d5 worse because that knight f5 move hits harder with your bishop on e7 and pawn on g7 undefended. And finally, I thought of the idea of improving the knight through e5 or b6. And then even with rook c8, you could maybe trade it on c4 for white's worst piece, which is not super appealing. I could take my decent piece and spend a bunch of time trading it for their worst piece. What am I trying to get at with that? I can't go g6, bishop g7. g6 is pretty good against g4, g5 to stop the pawn from getting to g6. But my opponent's not committed to that plan yet. I don't want to play g6, bishop g7, leaving this pawn hanging on this file. And g6 too early. Maybe in some universe, white could go for f4, f5. Maybe they play bishop d3 to defend the e-pawn, right? And then just go f4, f5 and bring the rook to the center. So I wasn't totally sure how I wanted to advance from here. And then finally, queen c7 might improve the queen, but you always have to worry about bishop takes b5. So with that said, let's advance a little bit further into the game. I played bishop f2, king b1, And now, very interesting move, queen a5. So here's where I'll mention like queen c7, which I considered was here, 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 here. Sorry if that was too fast. I apologize. Okay. So some people may not be familiar with this sack, but it's a standard Najdorf sack, which is when the pawn on d6 and the queen on c7, you can get this knight b5 fork. You can give the bishop, or even one of the knights if you prefer. You sack it here. If they don't take, you know, you've won a pawn and you're putting more pressure on black. And wherever the queen moves, we're going to trade everything off on d6 because knight d6 threatens the rook. We can't play around a queen on d6. We get this position. Now, 3 pawns against a knight in an endgame. 3 connected passed pawns. Generally, this is like always playable for white. And 3 connected passed pawns in general are better than a knight in an endgame. Now here I thought the presence of opposite colored bishops, which is not standard for this kind of endgame, would probably favor black because it means more chances to attack white's king as the pawns try and move, and more chances of blockading the pawns. So I thought compared to the normal sacks on b5, this is probably a little bit better for black. Probably fully playable, but I was not confident that I'd be any better. Okay, I'm black. Maybe that's too much to think, but yeah, I was unsure on that a little bit. And then, of course, other options, d5. I rejected this here because of knight f5, and this is hanging. And sometimes you like to play bishop f6 in these positions, which would be an advantage of already being out, but not if there's knight d6, which, as I told you, is why I hesitated about, do rook c8 and bishop e7 even help me to play d5? Do I even want those moves on the board? So I rejected d5 there for that. The move that I think is perhaps best in this position is maybe knight e5. And I mean, you know, what I played is not terrible, but this move is also very interesting. Nothing wrong with knight e5, I think. Fully playable. But I went queen a5. And this move, you can basically never play b4, because after knight a2, your queen's undefended on a5, and you just lose the pawn for nothing. So basically the point of this move here is just to force through rook takes c3, almost like no matter what, just we're doing it. And forcing white to mess up their structure when you do so. In that sense, I mean, maybe my opponent could even play bishop e1 here to try and stop rook takes c3. I don't feel like I really considered that hard during the game. I don't think I took that move very seriously, but I would say there's nothing wrong with it, honestly. It stops black's main idea. The queen's probably going to just come back to c7 at some point and keep playing, you know, allow this bishop takes b5 thing maybe. Yeah, maybe bishop e1 was... I didn't think of that, even when I was analyzing the game a little bit afterwards. Yeah, because the game's... Yeah, I mean, black's just playing rook takes c3. That's all there is to it. Oh, the other thing black could be doing is getting white to play knight b3. Do I have that in my notes? Yeah, knight b3, queen c7, takes, here. And without the second knight attacking d6, c2 is hanging. So I thought that with the knight b3 move, I could go to c7 and there wouldn't be this sack. And I looked at it a little bit afterwards, and I think that's correct. So I could retreat the queen, and there'd be no sack yet. White could come back to d4, threatening the same thing. And then what I would do next, I don't know. But, you know, I could get queen c7 for free, basically, that way. Okay, queen a5. Let's see the game. So we could go on and on. White played h3. I was surprised by this. I always expected g3 would come first. Played h3, and I played h4. I took the timeout. I can sack on c3, but no, I'm not letting white play g4 cleanly, right? If I can do this to their structure, it's definitely being done. Expanding the rook. I thought about, you know, queen e1 and queen g5 trying to win this pawn and thought, whatever. So hopefully I was right about whatever, right? Because that's not a super deep line, but No, I looked a little bit more at it, but let's keep going. G4 was played. I take here. So yeah, so now the rook's got a file, the bishop's got a target, but white's structure has gotten worse on the king side. I could play a slow move like G6 for sure. That was my default move in this position. As soon as white makes the pawn trade with the G pawn, G6 is just the default move for me. But I was feeling very brave and confident. And I decided to just go for rook takes c3. Like in the previous game I've shown you. That's partly why I'm showing you these two games together. They're my best games, but they're also kind of a pair. Because they're both, Sicilians with rook takes c3. I only thought that this would be about equal, but I really thought that I had great chances to outplay my opponent in a bunch of the positions that could come up from this move. So it was, a very confident choice. Now, my opponent played bishop to e1, just waiting to take it without messing up the pawns, right? Let's just quickly give you my gut take on a couple options. Here. In this version, I've taken 0 pawns for the exchange that I've sacked, but I'm playing d5 next. And look at white's ragtag trash. I'm expecting my knight to beat a rook in this endgame just off of all these terrible pawns to defend, just positional. No knight and 0 pawns. But for example, if they take, count white's isolated pawns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 out of 5 isolated. By the way, I consider doubled pawns isolated because they can't defend each other. So I actually thought black would already be much better here. This pawn's attacked, this pawn's attacked. King b2 defends both. I come here, threatening knight a4. These moves are both pawn sacks forever. I'll slowly capture all 5 of these pawns for nothing. That's kind of a dream. Okay, some more aggressive options for white after d5. There'd be, just these pawns are trash anyway. Just see if you can mess up black's position a little bit with them before you go down. That's advice for any white player who's kind of a beginner around these rook takes c3 things and stumbles into them without really knowing what to do. Oops, didn't realize black was going to do it. Just trying to muss things up a little bit. Get an open file at least. Your pawns aren't worth much, so lose them, but make your rooks better. This would be, messy still, maybe about equal. There's a a4 move thrown in here. There's also the option to play e5 here, I think. Knight h5. And let's say maybe king b2. Again, it could be a4 here. I don't know. I'm just showing you a position. And in this position, I analyzed one sort of longer variation where I trapped the rook, but I noticed knight takes e6. If I take, there's rook takes g6. If I go bishop f6. Here I already thought it's too messed up. The whole position's busted. I didn't see knight c7 d5 because I stopped the line here. But I already thought this is fine for white. And so my preference was going to be to play g6, keeping my pawn, and giving white time to play f4. And I thought black is better now. A little bit, minutely better. I've got still 0 pawns for the exchange, so I'm very confident, I guess. But I've got the bishop pair and a bunch of weaknesses to attack, so I was happy with this position. Okay, so that's queen c3. I mean, it's not even that dumb, right? You can see, I think for sure this is a perfectly viable option for white, my a4 variation. Perfectly viable. So that's what I mean by, I was being confident when I went for this rook takes c3. The other move that white could play is knight b3, but that's a straight up mistake because I go queen b6. Hitting the rook. Oops. He thought I couldn't do anything about my knight and queen. And then white would have to go bishop f2, I assume, to save the rook, and I would bring this rook back. Yeah, I mean, at first I thought and then what, I just have to go queen c7 or something and still get the pawns doubled? No, bring the rook back. And now white's playing with a rook against 2 pieces. And, their structure's not ruined, but they're down material, so oops. Okay, so my opponent played bishop e1, which is perfectly good as well. And now there's a very tough choice for black. You could play d5, making your important pawn break, right? Or you could choose to stay in a middle game with queen b6. You're going to get e5, forcing white into passivity. And what else? Yeah, I think that's the major choices on this move. And then there's the move I played in the game. Rook takes a3. Again. We'll see that in a moment. So d5 immediately here takes, boom. Now, what's difficult about this is we're getting the d5 pawn break. We're taking apart their whole center, but we're opening up the rooks, right? So I guess white could play fe4, knight e4, or they could play rook g7, e takes f3, and give me that passed pawn and think they can deal with it. But here's my problem with this in general. I get rid of white's center, and my pieces are pretty free, but I do have some weaknesses to attack, and white will eventually have a 3-on-2 majority on this side of the board and moves like a4 and c4 to get things going, and also the board is opened up for the rooks instead of white having a phase where they're tied down to their weaknesses. So I have to play pretty aggressively in this kind of a position. Like maybe here. I have to really go for it with these two passed pawns because ultimately white's got play here and the rooks aren't going to be bad in this position. So I can't slowly build up. I have to sort of like try and race these pawns down the board and make them a threat to queen, which is not easy to do, and I wasn't even confident that it's doable in this exact position. So that's like d5 I was a little bit leery of. And then queen b6, white gets no structural defect. All I get is some activity because the knight has to go back and defend the rook. And now I can either play the d5 break, just going totally aggro. Now I'm sacking a pawn as well as the exchange. Or I could spend a move on g6. So here I keep queens on the board, which I do like. But the fact that I've won 0 pawns and not damaged white's pawn structure was a bit much from my perspective. So I was a little bit worried with this one here, and I even gave it a dubious mark in my annotations for now. And then there's the move I played, which is probably best. There's no exclam on it yet, but I think this is best. What I finally decided was the most valuable thing I could do was not make progress against white center with d5, but was to get rid of one pawn on the queen side so white would not have a pawn majority anywhere. So I'm emphasizing hamstringing white from having any real plans. And the a pawn is technically in my theory of material and pawns and stuff, like my baseline is that rook pawns are the least valuable pawns, right? Like you compare that with I could be playing d5 and winning a pawn on e4 with my tempo instead of a3. Very un-David. I generally value the center super, super highly. But here it was like, I'm just going to reduce white from having any area in the board where their structure is powerful and healthy in a way where white can develop any play. So I go here and eliminate white's positional options for offensive ideas on the queen side. We get to this position and then just g6, again, valuing my pawn more than any of white pawns. This is again a position where you could strongly consider d5, right? Because here again, we're going to get something like this. And okay, I don't know which piece to put on e4, so my variation didn't go past this, but let's assume that black captures on e4 in some way. All right, my feeling about this is, again, I'm forced to play in a pretty aggressive way with my pawns because I've improved white's rooks. So it might be a playable line. I do have 2 connected passed pawns. This is a weak H pawn. This is reasonable for like a knight and pawn and strong central control versus the exchange. It's totally be playable. We've got all 4 of the minor pieces on the board, so I'm still covering all the squares, and the rooks can't just zoom around wherever they want. But I ultimately said my 2 pawns are slightly more valuable than white's 2 pawns, so I'm not playing d5 yet. Not at the cost of this. My 2 pawns are slightly more valuable than white's because my 2 pawns are part of a bigger pawn island and white's are part of a smaller pawn island. My pawns have more flexibility. I can play g6, I can play e5, I can play d5. White can't play f4 without hanging this, can't play e5 without hanging that, and maybe f3 behind it. So I decided my pawns are just worth more than white's pawns, period, positionally, plus pawn trades are slightly in favor, are clearly in favor of the rooks in general. So I played g6 here, even though it gives white a tempo to play something like bishop b4 or bishop c7 and mess with my plan of d5. And white played the better of the 2 moves and the most likely move this. I'm just going to mention one funny thing about bishop c7. Against bishop c7, which I was quite worried about during the game, it's covering e5 so that against d5, you play e5, keep this piece in, knight h5. I think this is still perfectly good for black, but I found better than that, which is e5, kicking the knight, and then d5. And it turns out this bishop's not letting white play e5, and it's just losing a tempo when the knight comes to d5. You can make it worse for yourself with brilliant knight a5, bishop a8, takes, and you're trapped. That's the funny thing I wanted to mention. Ridiculous, this well-placed piece loses the whole game. So instead, white can just take here, and now I've got everything, right? I kicked white's piece back. This is the dream position for me. I've got all the minor pieces on the board, positional advantages, 2 isolated pawns to torture. Not much counterplay for the opponent. That's my dream, which I think basically mildly refutes bishop c7. Bishop b4 is played, which I think is a little bit better. I played e5, giving myself an exclam, but this is something I have to revisit because a much stronger player told me I should have just played d5, my original plan. Bishop e7, king e7, takes and takes. Like this, right? Rook e1. It's going to go exactly the same as the game, but with a pawn on e5 or e6. Now, I thought I want to advance my pawns a little bit, right? Get more and more imposing in the center and towards the king side. But I also know I've got some maneuvering to do to improve the d7 knight. All my other pieces are golden, but this piece needs to be improved, and that can be a little tricky to do. My friend argued that in this position, still having the pawn on e6 lets black use this as an outpost for knights and bishops. Keeps white from having a file they can use, in other words, and gives you more time. It's slower, and it gives you more time to improve this piece. I thought I was being a genius here when I improved on my original plan with this e5 move, advancing things, and I need to do much deeper analysis before I can say what's right here. So just don't believe that exclam for now. Very tentative. So this is the point of bishop b4 for white. They spent that tempo. Here they can't prevent d5 after I play g6, right? There's no preventing it. So they spend their tempo on trading off my bishop pair. When you're up in exchange, rooks hate bishop pairs. So even though it's equal that we're both trading off bishop pairs, white's rooks are going to benefit more from the loss of bishop pair than black's rook. So it's very, very logical use of white's time. Trade. Yeah, it's logical white wants to stop knight e3 from getting in, and then black can always take on f1 if they want and take h3. Then you're up 2 pawns for the exchange and you're pressuring f3, right? So, yeah, I mean, you want to take away knight e3. Up to here, I had definitely assumed that it would come like this. I'd predicted this whole position before sacking the rook, I think. That's what my notes say. I think up to here it was all sort of predictable, and I'd planned to play knight f4 in this position. And I predicted the same thing with the pawn on e6. And I was planning to play knight f4 here, and thought maybe it would make white play knight d2, which did actually happen, but I also had considered rook g4 here. Anyway, we could stop and assess for a second, right? I've got one pawn for the exchange. White's got two isolated pawns. Minimal counterplay for now. I would say black is on the good side of equal here. Even though technically we're still down material, right? And we're fighting a rook in an endgame with a knight. It's very different than the previous rook c3, a3 I showed you. Same moves. How often does that happen that you get to play rook c3 to a3 sacking a rook, but to do it twice in the same tournament? I know. But two totally different games. One is really based on king safety, and this one is based on just playing an endgame because I had positional advantages on the king side. But I think black's very comfortable here. You know, notably white's bishop's not very good. Two isolated pawns to defend. Yeah, I'm very comfortable with black. But, you know, maybe someone else could disagree. I don't. You know, I thought it was still probably close to equal. So when I say slightly better and give myself some exclams, it's kind of from a human or practical perspective that I'm comfortable playing here. So when I go knight f4, pawns hit on f3, so the knight goes passive instead of the dream of maybe going knight a5 and then c4 with the bishop on a8. Like if white's move here after rook here, you could now go maybe knight a5, bishop a8, c4. Right, and the bishop's a little bit restrained, and you can open up your bishop and target a6. Maybe a small advantage for white. Okay, but here, yeah, he's got to respect it. Me taking on f3, and then I've got connected passed pawns. So he defends it, and yeah, this is my thought. I'm advancing, I'm grabbing space. I would love to improve this knight, but the e5 pawn's hanging. And yeah, I could defend it with king f6, but then there's always knight e4 to reckon with, right? So I put the knight here to defend this pawn in order to put this pawn forward in order to bring my king up. So the whole point of this is to provide a better square for my king where he's going to defend these pawns, and then I'll be able to improve the knights. It's a somewhat slow process. And yeah, if I were going to highlight, I had thought about, you know, including Pranav's best moves in my highlight videos, but eventually just decided to cover this whole game in its own video. But two of the moves that I would have highlighted for him, one of them is this rook e3 here, getting the rook. Like recognizing that things could go badly for white over time, and he gets creative with this and one other move, trying to really shake things up, which I think it's very important to know when the long term is looking bad for you and you should shake things up versus when the long term is looking good for you and you can take your time and be calm. So he's up an exchange, but realizes that he's under some forms of long-term pressure and that he should fight very aggressively to make his rooks felt. Because right now, is anybody feeling these rooks? I'm not. My king's about to kill both of them, and then both my knights will be free. With just one king holding back the two rooks. So he comes and struggles, which is good. And by the way, when I looked at Pranav and Anand's games, this kid is super good. He beat Kostya earlier in the tournament, but I saw a game of his in a ChessBase article from a year or two ago where he played one of the most unthinkable combinations I've ever seen. It was just all over the board. It was like sacrifices with ideas of promoting, with ideas of trapping the opponent's queen, with the idea of deflecting, trapping the queen with a hanging rook, where the queen could take the rook, but then he turns his attention to, you know, the other side of the board and breaking a blockade. But if the queen doesn't accept the rook sack, then he traps the queen in the middle of the board. But then after all sorts of stuff happens, he then suddenly turns to a checkmating attacking us. It was just absolutely insane. I saw that game and thought, if he can calculate like that, I mean, I can't keep up. So I was very, very impressed with this player. And here's like a very nice move. He comes up with rook e3. So the rook's going to look for some kind of angle to get into the game at c3 or a3. I continue my plan of defending this, even though it weakens these squares here, but it frees up the knight to come back to d5 and control the c7 square, because now my king is dealing with this rook. So I have to retreat, unfortunately. And now here, I was afraid that this move c4 is coming. And I would love to answer with, you know, b4 and a blockade on c5 and just move my knight back to f4 and just have a pawn on c4, my friend, you know, killing your bishop and knight more. But The problem was in no scenario did I see how I would deal with, rook a5 pressuring the blockade square at c5. Like I just didn't have the tempi for it to work out, for this tricky b4 thing, right? Like, I don't know how we want to say it. Like, even if I've just come straight back here, right? And I didn't really get there in time, or do I have knight e6 now? Maybe in this version it's just rook a4 because the knight's already moved back and his pawn's hanging, so I don't have a5 and I don't have knight c5. Also, my deep instinct was to play this mysterious rook move. I know, leaving this pawn alone, but looking at d2 and d1 while white is discoordinated, and I simply could not justify the tactics here. Like I couldn't figure out what do I do after c4. I know I'm looking at this knight, I just couldn't find it. And I'm going to analyze this a lot more later on because this is my strong instinct. And for anyone who wants like a quick tip on, how to analyze your games, you don't need to thoroughly figure every single thing out about a game. But if there's a move that you really thought during the game that looks like a good move, but I can't prove it or justify it, and then you don't play it, that's, a classic example of what you want to go back and check later to see, was it good? Was it right? Should I have done this? How right or wrong was my instinct? I mean, that is the kind of thing you want to revisit. So I will revisit that at some point. Also, this move looked logical to me. My bad knight, right? Improve it. And then after c4, trade. This was like the very first number one most basic thing I looked at. And in this position, I just couldn't find the right continuation. Like I wanted to go here, attacking this. And then there's bishop takes d5 here. Bishop takes d5, check. And white gets this and black gets this. That's complicated, probably equal. But it was this that I was hung up on during the game, bishop a6, trying to leave me with the stupid knight, right? Because here white's got real winning chances if black takes. And I just didn't see where to put the bishop in this position. Like somehow I couldn't get anything to work with these moves. So I was very worried about this position, but that was like my basic position. I kept thinking about it, and then finally I chose to retreat the good knight and leave the bad knight here because my calculations told me that was what had to happen. And the point is that now the bishop is not blocked by a knight. So if white played c4, I could go takes, right? And on bishop a6, my bishop's got a great square to go to, right? The best square. And now white faces 3 connected pass pawns, and, good luck, white. You're going down. So, tactics. Just calculation made me play the move I didn't want to play. I looked at, all kinds of moves here. I spent a lot of time and effort on this because, he's fighting. And I'm not getting what I want here. I looked at rook c8, rook d8, knight c5, knight b6, both knights to b6, rook h4, preemptive b4 myself. When the rook has to come here and before the c4 break even happens, and then we're stopping. Right now we're sort of stopping c3 because we take on by soul, and that square we can control. It's a dark square, but the rook comes alive. This is threatened, and wasn't so obvious. So finally, I played a move I didn't like, but that I could work out how it was dealing with white's main threats. Played rook d3, threatening to come into d6. And now, I can't go knight d5 because that's a repetition. I played bishop d5 to shut the rook out. And again, that's in the way of where I want my pieces to go, right? I'm not getting what I want, but I'm close to getting what I want. Okay, I'm close to getting what I want because if white plays a random move here, king c1 or whatever it might be, I'm going to play knight c5, hitting the rook, right? And then let's say rook c3 or whatever. Knight e6. And this bad knight is just one tempo away from doing everything it needs to. Once it's on e6, it's covering the dark square penetration points for the rook to match with the bishop, right? The knight and the bishop work together, thanks to the bishop and knight checkmate that I learned long ago. And the knight starts to control f4 to keep this pawn under control. Knight d4 as a hop if white ever plays c4, right? Becomes like a beautiful outpost, pressuring f3. So I'm not far from fixing things. I'm still not far from fixing things. So white has to keep scrambling and struggling. If they chill out, I'm still going to take over this game. Okay? And I'm not only blocking the rook, but I'm sort of locking down c4 here. So yeah, it's not at all obvious what white's supposed to do. And here's the second highlight for Pranav Anand is he came up with a pretty interesting and sick move right here, which was f4. Okay, I've given it a dubious mark now, I guess, after I did some analysis on it. It's weird because I want to call it like a highlight, but I think this was like a really strong move that gave him really good practical chances against, a player like me in what was starting to become a time scramble, right? We're at move 32, starting to get pretty low. Again, he's aware these are just bad pawns. So, be willing to just get rid of them if it wakes up your pieces. Before I get further into that, I think I'll just mention one other thing. I'd expected rook a3, I think, as the main move, and I was planning to play this miserable move. And I show you this just to highlight really quickly some of the changes in me as a player, because there's a couple moves I would have never done in the past, and that's one of them. And this is the other one. In the past, I would have refused to retreat this piece. Even if I didn't see how to justify rook d8 or rook c8, at some point, I would have just played one of the moves that I wanted to play and hoped that somehow he didn't play c4, or that once he played c4, I would find the refutation that I couldn't find, for 20 minutes while thinking about rook d8. So I just wouldn't play this kind of, my best piece, disimproving my best piece. That's just not something that was in my repertoire. I didn't have that patience or that acceptance of sometimes having to do things you don't want to do. And along with that, let's just say rook a3, the point of knight b6 was I had already seen and envisioned that I would have to play rook a8 to keep this rook at bay. I'd seen, rook d3, bishop d5, rook a3, rook a8. Again, this is one thing that's similar. I could go back and forth and take the draw. And I don't think I'm winning or anything. I think it's close to equal. But I was still believing in my abilities to outplay, even if I have to take my rook off of this. And I was sad, I didn't yet have time to play g5. This pawn can get to h4. The bishop can... I don't know. It's annoying. It's a move I would never play before. Again, my other best piece to a bad square. But I was willing. And believing that, I could still make things work out. And that's what white should have done, rook a3. I think. I mean, I haven't analyzed in depth, but obviously analyzed a little bit. So this move here, very, very creative attempt to get things going. And it gives black difficult decisions, like e4 makes a protected passed pawn, keeps more pawns on the board. You can hope to attack this pawn later. It looks very weak still here on f4 against knight c5 to e6 at some point. So it's somewhat tempting, but again, he locks down two pawns with the f pawn for the moment. The rook defends this pawn laterally, which frees up this piece. e4 blocks my own bishop and things become stodgy, and I don't know where my pieces are headed. So I thought, and I went for taking it, even though he's got a great idea here of bishop g2. And yeah, my instinct was that if e takes f4 was really bad, that I could play e4 and it shouldn't be losing. It should survive. It should be playable. It keeps the position locked up. But I decided to challenge his idea and calculate this move. So I spent my effort on this, and then I found a good move, and so I went for it. And I think he may have underestimated this follow-up. So f4 is a good idea, but I think he must have missed something in this variation here. So I spent my effort on the complicated move, and since it worked, I went for it instead of e4. So I don't really know for you guys how good or bad e4 was. I didn't think about it much during the game, other than noticing it, and nor afterwards, because I like my decision. Knight e5. So this move here is based on, is hitting the rook. If he takes here, I take the rook, and then here and here. Well, I'm just up 2 pawns and winning easily. But the trickier point, it's not that tricky, but perhaps he didn't see when he played f4, is that I can sack the 2 pieces for the rook, and then after rook d8, he's got no way to save the pieces. One of them goes, and then I win, right? Then again, we're in a situation where I'm just up 1 or 2 pawns far away from his king. Typical Sicilian endgame. Once it's equal material, I'd even be winning, and here I've got more pawns. So knight e5, yeah, just messes white up. I also consider knight c5. It's a close call between the two. Against each move, white could either go rook a3, trying to get into the 6th rank here, or rook d4, still trying to get in at d6. So you have to calculate both options. With knight e5, he went rook d4. He could have gone rook a3, and again, rook 8, another move that I would have almost never played in the past, giving up eyeing h3 to just come back. But, I've gained the pawn, past f pawn for free here, right? My knight will be happy to come to d5, g5, f3 coming. So, yeah, I think this is good. I thought that in this position he could trade and then play h4 to stop g5, and it would slow me down, but that black would still be preferable or for choice here. I mean, look, my knights are well placed. I've got 2 passed pawns, even though they can't really help each other. They're almost starting to become isolated pawns since this one can't keep up. But white's low on counterplay, and the passed pawns are pretty good. My central knights are pretty good, so I believe that I would still be somewhat better, if not yet winning. Rook d4. Yeah, I had another nice move here. King e6. Holding the rook out and giving this pawn. The alternative is f3, which I spent more time calculating, again, because that's the kind of move you have to calculate more precisely. White can take a couple times and give a check. I don't know, here. So this might be perfectly playable for black, because you do keep the 2 connected passed pawns. You can trade and take and give up this. This might be playable for black. I mean, you're really in on queening these pawns, since now the queen side's obviously broken. White's rook is active, and I'm not that close to queening yet, so I decided, evaluation-wise, that I wasn't pumped about it. And instead of going for f3, I decided to just hold everything together, even though it lets him take back this pawn. But I don't necessarily need that pawn. He didn't play the main line, so I'm going to show you the main line first. If he goes rook f4, as I expected, I would now trade to get the h-pawn. And here I expected rook f1, and I was going to go knight d5. So, if you compare this to that other position, the other position is kind of similar, but with a white rook super active on a6 or whatever compared to this, right? So this is better. I guess the other difference is the other position, there's a piece traded, which might make it easier to queen, but I mean, we just don't want the white rook active like that if we've got an option like this, right? 2 connected passers, knights in the center. Yeah, I thought black has a clear advantage here. And that's what I mainly expected in the game. So I think king e6 clearly better than that f3 option. I also glanced at the move knight b3, and there I was just going to trade it off. Knight c5 is threatened and potentially annoying. I'm not sure. I was planning to just trade it off and then stuff the pawn. And now you can see this bishop's really, really bad. I know bishops are usually good in endgames, so are rooks, but this position is different, right? White no longer has any lever to ever get this bishop out. White can't break through any part of my light square pawn structure with all their ratty pawns. So might even be a matter of time before black wins, but I just said clear advantage for black. So my opponent traded and then went for knight b3 here, threatening knight c5. Again, I still believe the best option, right, was for them to take on f4, but I would trade and get h3, and you saw that position. So trade a knight here, and I had, we're at move 36. I'm getting a little bit low on time, but I calculated correctly that I could go for knight f3. It's not super complicated, but in the past I always got these things. I haven't been so confident in this. I calculated it right. You know, the alternative is just rook c8 stopping knight c5. I don't see anything wrong with that, but I didn't look at it too much. I calculated the main variation as much as I could, you know, maybe 3 or 4 minutes out of the 5 I had, and went for it. Check. King has to go this way, leaving, you know, all my stuff hanging. If you've got an hour on the clock, this is nothing. It's easy to calculate. But when you've got 3 minutes, you know, it's a little bit nerve-wracking. Okay, so there's rook a6, there's rook d5, there's rook a6. He played rook d6. So we'll just focus on that to keep going. I'll just tell you, like, the other moves aren't better. Like rook a6. Okay, whatever. We'll just see a line. Rook a6, takes, boom. So now there's no knight b5 because of check and knight b4. Otherwise, you might say, oh, white's got 2 connected passers too. But even then, this pawn's going to queen 4 moves before those. It doesn't look like it's that far ahead, but it is. Even if I don't have knight b4, f3 probably wins, but I have knight b4. So here I thought rook d6. And then I think I found just pushing in this position, or is it knight e3 first? f3, knight takes f3 seems wrong. So, okay, yeah, knight e3. It covers knight takes f5. Yeah, I thought that white couldn't stop this pawn. And one cool variation was rook e6, trying to stop f3. f3 anyway, rook e3, f2. White can't stop the pawn from queening. I'm hanging everything as I push the f pawn, right? And I even pick up the rook, so we don't need to worry about if we can win this endgame or not if the rook came to f3 and pawn to c3 or something. Just win it with check. So that was very nice. That's just one line I calculated. I didn't calculate everything here, but I didn't see anything really to stop f3, f2, f1, other than knight sacks for the pawn and this rook e6 thing, which I refuted. Okay, so that's one example. Rook d6 was played. I take here, and go knight e3. Similar, he hasn't taken this, and I haven't yet taken this. So here he's got no counterplay for white, but I'm winning a little bit slower. He's got time to try to blockade, but still, he can't stop rook h3. His kings would struggle to get back into the middle of the board against this knight, which has knight c4 and is covering d1 already. And this rook, which is going to be active. So this is like a typical Sicilian endgame. This is what I want to point out. Something like this, these endgames are almost always winning for black, honestly. You know, even if white's rook were on h2, put white's rook on h2 so they're not losing this pawn. You can say material is about equal, but the king just ends up being far away on the queen side, and black ends up being strong in the middle of the board. Their knight ends up on a better square than white's, and then they push up a pass pawn down the center of the board while keeping strong space in the center, and there's huge advantages for black in a lot of these endgames. Here it's particularly easy because, well, white doesn't even have time to do these racing options because of some direct calculations, and so he just sort of comes back. And king e7, if I go rook h3, I calculated that I could do that, right? Rook e6, king d7, and there's no time for rook e3, so it's still about the same. So I calculated this is probably winning. But I calculated as far as here and saw that I can't just auto-queen the pawn, like he's close enough. So I have to sort of still play the whole board to win it. And then I decided, well, there's much easier than this. I can get the same position, but with white's king on a2 in the game, and the pawn gone, basically. So I do. So here I go king e7 first, hitting the rook. If rook a6, you know, we'll still go here, here, and then just queen this pawn after the knight goes to some stupid square like h7 or e6. So I knew on king e7, he's still going to bring the rook this way, attack this, and try and hold the blockade like this with these pieces defending each other, but it's very tight quarters, and I had planned this. And now if the rook moves, the knight goes, and if the knight moves, the rook goes. And white has one last chance to move the knight here, because once black plays king f6. It's done. White's going to lose pieces to knight d5. So he takes the last chance to go here, 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 and not lose pieces. But then I get this pawn. So that's the difference. And again, I could play king e5, king e4, and queen the pawn, probably in this case with the king here instead of here. But I just took another pawn. I'd seen that this king can't get into a5 because of king b4, knight c6, so the king went here. I think this is my first time playing a knight endgame since working for so long on the Averbach knight endgame book. So it was my first chance to see if that book had brought me anything or not, and I think it did. You see, I mean, it's not the hardest of knight endgames with 2 extra pawns, including an outside-ish passed pawn. It'd be really easy if this pawn were G or H. But I think, you know, you can kind of see that I knew what was going on. I played f4, king d3, king e5. So here, yeah, so one thing I recognized was, like, in this case, instead of going knight c6, if the king's here, I just want to go knight e6. Now the king won't have time to do this thing anymore. And this knight will be slightly better here, getting the pawn going. Now we bring the f-pawn first. I'd also looked at king e5 for a while, and then king b4 is just a little bit messier, because if you go knight d4 and make the knight move, and then go knight c6, there's king c5. So once you go king e5, king b4, you just have to queen this pawn. If the knight sacks for it, you've blown it. So I thought it was cleaner to play f4 first, because right now the king, you know, has a harder choice to make. I can still keep him out of a5 if I want to, and I'll get this tempo and just start running. So he goes king d3, I play king e5, and the idea is to take away the e4 square from the king. Next, I want to give check with the knight and play king e4, king e3 myself. Just barreling into the middle of the board. We're fighting for space for our kings and our knights here. And there's 3 moves for white here that I really considered: king c3, knight c3, and b4. Let's test how good my knight endgame is by seeing if I can remember how I was going to beat each of those moves. So he played b4 in the game, so let's try knight c3. I think I would play knight c5 check here, while the king has to back up. Then I think I would play b4 when the knight still has to back up. Yep. And now I don't know where I expected his knight to go, but I've obviously won all the territory now. That makes the most sense, to have some hope of going either direction. And if you go king e4, there's maybe still knight f2 to push you back to d4 and play here. Although by that point, I mean, you could come over here, take this and sack this and win, but I think I would just play a5, etc. here. a4. Yeah. And white's just on the back foot to deal with this pawn. Okay, so that's knight c3. King c3. I would play king e4 now. That's kind of the point of this position. Yep. King b4 is the only move you really need to contend with. Now f3 is probably going to be more tempo-wise than king e3. But king e3, knight f4, king f4, king a5, knight d4 is just a winning endgame anyway without the a pawn. We're still close enough. So we could do king e3 or f3. f3, knight g3 check. Oh yeah, I wanted to play king e3 here, not f3, because of knight g3 and getting to the f1 square. So I play king e3 here, yes, when the knight can't stay in contact with any of these squares. He has to either sack immediately or head off to the queen side, and then he's kind of cut out of the action. So let's say knight c3, because I've already told you that this position here is just always a win. The king can always come around, and there's just nothing to do. You can't ever unseat the knight. It's over. So king e3, knight c3. Now let's go f3. Maybe king a5. Now knight d1 check is the idea. I still have knight d4 though, so I could allow that. If I get fancy with king d2, there's knight e4. I could play knight c5, I think that's fancier than what I planned during the game. You could go knight c5 here as black, and then against b4 or king b6, play king d2. No, play king d3. Yeah. Okay, I'm pretty sure I just planned f2 here, but because it's practical. And in a game, you're just very practical. But like, here's this idea. King b6, king d3, king takes here. This is probably sound. Yeah, it's probably sound. So basically with knight c5, this is very fancy. You take away knight e4, now you only have to deal with knight here. If he gives check before the pawn's on f2, you just come forward and attack him, right? And he can't sack, so he just has to walk away, and then you come over here. Now there's no knight e4 because of this knight, right? So whatever they do, the pawn just goes home. Okay, that's a very, very fancy way to win it. I think it probably sound, but in the game I just planned f2, I'm pretty sure. Minus plus. Yeah, perfect. Perfect. See, it did do something, all that work. Okay, he played b4 in the game, which stops knight c5 gaining territory and stops a5, a4 with, you know, an outside potential pass pawn. So this move makes a lot of sense. And, oh yeah, and I had a weird way to win here, because the more obvious move is like, can you push ahead with f3 and go for it? But here I'd seen a cool rearranging of the knight, which normally you don't do because you're holding the opponent's knight off. You only rearrange once their knight has to back away. But I played knight c7. And the idea is just to play knight d5. just take that pawn. Well, there's really no way to stop it, because if he goes knight c3, I just play knight d5, right? I've got the advantage of all trades. So he played knight d4, going for some desperation check. Knight d5, it's all he can do. He gives check, I come here, gives check, I come around. So now he can hold the pawn from c6 or c2, but this is kind of going. And if he had just played knight c2 straight away from here, now his knight's stuck to passive and I go f3 because my knight's covering this and my pawn's covering this. And now he has to move, right? He's sort of in Zugzwang, and if his king gives way, my king comes forward. Simple enough, right? So he gave the checks, came to c2, I push, king d4 hitting the knight, I push. He has to do something again. His king's kind of locked out, his knight's stuck defending this. So this is the trick. And if I queen, there's knight here. And if I make a knight, then I've actually just sacked my pawn for nothing, right? His king just comes this way. But king f4. Just a classic little knight and pawn trick. And the knight can't get back to it. You know, it's funny, if you go king f3, then you may have messed up against this move. At least it's much trickier. Maybe there's still a winning move, but the point is, if you come here, for example, there's just knight here or knight c2, right? Similar thing. If you come here, there's another check, and you have to stop this move. Maybe here you could still win by then coming here. Anyway, the right move is king f4. Now there's just no nothing. The knight can't come here, and it can't give a check, and it can't set up a fork, and you queen. It's better to have your king on a square where it won't be forkable with the square you're going to, right? Compared to f3. That was it. Yeah, I mean, all around, just a very strong game. As you can see, I'm deeply interested in the positions that I had in those games, and also in the positions that I had in basically every round of this tournament, you know, when I was winning, losing, drawing, whatever. It was always very, very interesting, and I was very focused. And just now as I was doing this video, I think I sort of forgot the time and everything else. It was like I was back at the chessboard, and just all it was looking at positions and weighing advantages and disadvantages and calculating lines, and it's all just so fun to do that, isn't it? So that's the end of my highlights from the tournament. Overall, it was I think a well-played tournament for me, exceeding expectations, which I don't have too many expectations anymore. And as if you've seen my video on the dangers of chess, I tend to set my expectations very low now, purposely. It's one of my techniques. So, yeah, had a great time, and I'll probably do another video that references this tournament and talks about, assessing it. But for anyone who's stuck around through all these highlights and is like, I'm not waiting like weeks to find out how David did in this tournament that I'm not even going to care about anymore, and David cares about so much. It's all he can think about or talk about, which is true. Like all the time now, I'm just thinking about that tournament and the games and the positions and when might be the next one. But for anyone who wants to know, I had 2 losses, 4 draws, and 4 wins overall, 6 out of 10. You saw my 2 losses were in rounds 5 and 10. I don't think I was like particularly extremely tired at the end of each of the 5-day sets and then the rest day. I don't think that was particularly it. I think my opponents just played particularly well in rounds 5 and 10. They both beat me with black and just played really, really phenomenally. Overall, I only had 4 blacks. I scored 3.5 out of 4 with black. Normally you'd be like, a 6th white, how lucky. But, I lost 2 games with white and scored 3.5 with black. So it wasn't particularly lucky to have that extra white. I feel like almost with black, not trying so hard to win at all costs and gain an advantage was maybe helpful. But I don't want to get into too long a thing, just a brief thing. 6 out of 10, 2 losses to IMs rated like 24.99, so just on the cusp of being GMs. Before rating deflation, I guess either of them would already be GMs. They just played great, both of them. 4 games against GMs, 3 draws and 1 win. And 4 games against lower rated players, 3 wins and 1 draw. The 3 2100s I played were very close to me in strength. They were very strong players. I gained a few rating points, like 15 rating points. I performed around, 2430, 2440. So, up at a very good level if you consider rating deflation, compared to how I was before. Not bad at all. But most of all, I just had a great time. I mean, it was just interesting. So whenever the next tournament comes, I know that I will enjoy it. Maybe I'll do really badly at the next one, or maybe I'll do well, but I will enjoy it. And until then, I think many of you will play a tournament before me. So enjoy, and don't forget when you're at your tournament that there are lots of people not at a chess tournament who wish they were at a chess tournament. So don't do that whole suffering thing. Enjoy it. Enjoy it for all of us who wish we were there with you. All right, peace everybody. If you've got any questions, comments, all of that, I'll be there in the chat, in the comment section to answer and to discuss with all of you. So cheers.